Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today I'm talking to Lauren Graffin. Lauren had a really difficult journey through her PhD process and she shares her story with us today and talks about how she managed loss, how she looked to maintain balance, and how she learnt to sit with her feelings. And she gives all sorts of really useful advice. And so I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Lauren.
Hi, Emma.
Thank you so much for being here all the way from Wyoming, ladies and gentlemen. There's no expense spared here. Flying people in. Thank you. And I was just saying, I really, really appreciate you being here because you reached out and said that your journey has not been an easy one and that you wanted to share what you learnt with other people. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
No, I'm happy to share. I feel like I've learned a lot. So the best thing that can happen is to share that with somebody else, so it might help.
We are going to squeeze the wisdom out of you. So I always start with asking people about their experience of the PhD. And I know this links into some other things that we're going to talk about because your experience of loss and your working to achieve balance are kind of two key themes we're going to dive into. But to just give us a sort of general overview of that journey through and then how you've arrived at where you are today in Wyoming.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I did a PhD in drama. My background was, to be honest, I was in drama all the way through school. I was your very typical over dramatic child that everybody met and said she should be on the stage.
Love it. Me too.
Yeah. So I kind of was in it all the way through school and outside of school. And it became very clear to me through secondary school that I was going to end up in the arts somewhere. It was just a matter of where. And I ended up going to the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland and doing a degree in drama with a minor in Irish history. I had wanted to go to the University of Manchester and I didn't get accepted.
So did I. They didn't accept me either. See?
Oh my God.
What do they know? What do they know?
Yeah, so I didn't get accepted, so I was a bit annoyed. I ended up, God love University of Ulster, but I was a bit annoyed I ended up there because I wanted to leave home and because I felt like it was important to see other places. But anyway, because of that, I ended up spending my summers doing like Camp America, and I ended up getting randomly placed in a summer camp where I worked with people who were blind and visually impaired. So
amazing.
I ended up becoming really interested in working with people with disabilities, and then I combined that interest with theatre, which led me towards a master's in applied drama at the University of Exeter. So I went there for my master's, and then I did a thesis on disability arts and culture, but I felt like I got to a place where I would always be an outsider in the work because I didn't have a disability and I wondered how much I could offer. But whilst I was at Exeter, I kind of had this chance to be exposed to lots of really cool theatre companies, one of which was Rights and Sights. And after I looked at their work, they were a site-specific theatre company, so they were working outside theatres. And I found their work particularly interesting because I was looking at applied drama where a lot of the work was aimed at helping people in one form or another. You know, applied drama is when we use drama for a social purpose a lot of the time. And I was 22 at the time and wasn't very comfortable with this idea that I could help people, which it felt like kind of something that was a bit big for me. So I really liked Rights and Sights works because they seem to offer invitations to communities to become involved, but by no means were trying to help people.
Right.
Which then became my PhD. I had this niggling question about how we could engage people and community without having the goal to help, because that's all I saw in Northern Ireland. So much of Northern Irish community theatre was about fixing the problem. So that became my PhD, was looking at how we performed in community and place in post-conflict Northern Ireland, kind of outside our conflict identity. So that was how I ended up doing a PhD at Ulster. But I chose Ulster because at the time when I was applying to do my PhD, I'm from Northern Ireland. My dad was very ill. I wanted to be closer to home because I knew I would need to support my mum. And on top of that, I had a really good teacher in my undergrad, a gentleman called Paul Devlin, who had very much encouraged me in my work. And I had wanted to work with him because I knew that I was going to go through a rough time emotionally with Dad, and I needed to work with someone who I felt was going to support me as a person and not just the work. If that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. And what a smart choice, because I think a lot of people don't think so much about that relational part of the PhD in terms of the relationship with your supervisor, the pastoral aspect of working with your supervisor, and it can often get quite sticky. Yes, that really smart. And we're going to come back to that kind of moment in a minute in terms of that PhD moment, but we're going to just fast forward to in terms of finishing the PhD and then what happened after too, because people are really interested in people's journeys in, I guess.
Yeah, so I finished the PhD, and again, I don't know, in my 20s I just lived a life of extremes. I don't know if anybody else is like that, but I was in a long distance relationship with my now husband. My husband's American, so I ended up, before, I never attended my graduation for my PhD because I emigrated to the States, and because I married my husband, and then I wasn't allowed to work for 9 months, which was, I went from a period of like really intense work to not being allowed to do anything, which I don't recommend. But yeah, so I moved to the States, and once I was allowed to work, I worked as an adjunct in a couple of different colleges in California, which was a really wonderful experience, actually, because I went from teaching in Northern Ireland to teaching in a very, very diverse culture and working with institutions that were like 80% Hispanic and Latino. So that was I learned a lot in the working in those institutions. And then I was applying for jobs all around the States and actually got one in Wyoming. So I started that this year as a full-time tenure track position.
Amazing. How's it going?
Yeah. So really good. It is. I'm really enjoying it. And I'm honestly just really thankful to be working full-time, and that I got it just before the pandemic hit, because adjuncts are very vulnerable at this moment in time. So
amazing. So thank you for that. Now we're going to come back to that moment as you're starting your PhD, and your dad is not well, and you're working with your chosen teacher. So tell us a little bit about what happened then.
Well, Dad was kind of going through his stuff. Dad was going through chemo, I think, my first year, and then got a bone marrow transplant. Him and my mum had to move to Dublin, Ireland. We live in the north, so he could get that. So I was going through all that whilst doing my PhD, and I kind of made managing my kind of mental health and wellness a priority in that period of time. And then my supervisor was very supportive through that process. And then as I went into it was the summer before I started my third year of my PhD, I got a phone call from a colleague, which was like, "Lauren, are you sitting down?" And nothing ever starts well with "Lauren, are you sitting down?" No. But my PhD supervisor, Paul, had died very suddenly. He'd been on vacation with his family and died in the night. And he was 40, I want to say Paul was, and had three he had three very young children, and was a very kind of focused family man. So that was sort of a big emotional hit, because he had been I was very lucky that he had been very much a mentor and a very strong support system. So then I kind of had to figure out how to deal with that loss.
Yes.
Which was, you know, I was definitely forged by fire, but I got through that. But I had to do very specific things to try and cope with that and still complete a PhD, which suddenly didn't seem quite so important.
Yes, and I think this, I mean, those were very, very challenging, extreme situations that came together for you. That kind of double whammy for you, but I know that lots of people do experience loss. Maybe not such an extreme loss, but a lot of people experience loss through their PhD. It may be that their supervisor, I just was asked to take over supervision because somebody had retired or gone to another institution, or a relationship breaks down. And so there are these losses that happen. And as you say, then what had been your focus, maybe, as you exactly said, may seem less important now, or you need to find a way to manage that, because loss can be so profound and so destabilizing, because the carpet is literally pulled from beneath you.
Yeah, I do think my set of circumstances was pretty extreme, but I think we all experience loss in different ways. And what we shouldn't ever do is think, I think there's this comparison, is my pain bigger than yours?
Yes. No, absolutely.
We don't need to move there. I think we all experience loss, and they're all important, no matter how extreme or what their size is.
Well, exactly. And especially if it is a first loss that people are experiencing, which often is, and they kind of often the age that people are going through their PhD, it will be a first major loss, and that it has incredible ramifications. So tell us, share with us how you got through that.
Yeah. So the first thing I think when anybody's going through pain, hardship, or loss is to recognize that the only way to cope is to go through. You can't go over, you can't go under, you can't go sideways. You have to go through, because what I think the temptation is to distract yourself from the hardship or the pain, or to avoid it. And honestly, all that does is it puts it off for later and amplifies it. So the first thing I did kind of in the wake of that news was I took a week off. Just immediately. There was like no decision to be made. I just took a week off. And I sat with the enormity of the situation, which is not pleasant.
No.
But so important to just sit with your feelings. And I think one thing that we don't like to talk, a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about, is our feelings and our emotional life. But you cannot separate your work from how you are feeling at a given time.
No.
So don't pretend like you can. I hear academics say things like, to students, like when they're teaching, leave your worries at the door, or leave all your stuff at the door and be present in the room. Basically what you're asking someone to do is to split themselves in half. It's not possible.
Right.
So how about we just give space and time for the feelings, and then figure out a way to work through it. So that's what I did. I sat with my feelings and gave myself time to process it rather than to try and bypass it. And for me, that was, sometimes I had wanted to be alone. Sometimes I had to have conversations with good friends, and sometimes I like to spend time on my yoga mat. Sometimes I had to do that. And it was just given space and time to acknowledge the enormity of the situation and the hardship. So that was the first thing. And then eventually, when I was ready, and I'm not going to tell you in a week's time, the grief was over. That's not how it works. But what you do is when you give yourself this sort of space and time for feelings, is you open yourself up to a grieving process, and that's the thing that helps you function. So I eventually, when I kind of had my head on a bit straighter, I decided what I think is important is that you can often feel like you're a victim of your circumstance, and you can kind of get lost in why me? This is so difficult. Why has this happened? Blah, blah, blah. And that's, sometimes an important thing to indulge in for a while, but not for too long. And I think it's because the thing about being in that space is you're in a space of victimhood and you have no power in a space of victimhood. Yes. You're powerless. You're a victim of everything else. So you're stuck. And I think there's nothing more unbearable than feeling stuck.
Yes.
So I think what I did was to decide to accept the situation as much as I could mentally at that time, and decide, I can't control the situation, but I can control how I respond to it, and to really spend some time thinking about how I was going to manage this new reality. And for me, that was learning to listen to myself and think about what I really needed, and then to communicate that to others. Which is not easy.
I was just going to say, you took the words right out of my mouth. Listening to yourself is not easy, especially in that kind of situation. So were there particular things that you did to kind of tune in to what you were thinking, what you were feeling? You said yoga mat. That's
yoga mat was a big one for me, and I know it's different for everybody. For some people it's like going for a run, for some people it's cooking, for some you know what your thing is, and that's your thing that you need to do, where you can figure stuff out. I had to do that, but I also I had lots of conversations with different people, because I am someone who needs to speak to process. But one of the things that was hugely important to me during my PhD that I kind of accidentally stumbled into was I had kind of a writing practice that was separate to my PhD. People probably think I'm crazy. Why would you want to write any more than you already have to? But to try and manage my mindset, sometimes I'm one of those people, when I have repetitive thoughts, I have to just write them down to, first of all, realize when they're just crazy mad ideas, and that they shouldn't be taking hold in my brain. And also just to think about, okay, how am I feeling? What's going on for me? How do I move through this? I can do it easier on paper than if it's going round and round and round and round my head. So that was an important part of my process too. And that was an important part for my process prior to Paul passing away, was that to figure things out, I had to write it out. So that was a way that I kind of listened to myself, and then it was a matter of trying to communicate to others what I needed and what was the best way to do that. And that's very hard, particularly when you're in your early 20s.
Yes.
And you're talking to people who are so much more experienced than you, have had so many PhD students come through, and for you to say, I know you usually do things this way, but that doesn't work for me, I'm going to need X, Y, and Z. That's hard when you're 20. That was honestly very challenging for me in my 20s. And I had to sit down and have those conversations with my new supervisors. But I think I was lucky in the sense that I'd already completed 2 years and had a strong sense of what my working patterns were and what I really needed to do to manage my project and to move forward. And for me, a lot of it was around how feedback was delivered, and just really basic, mundane practices that I needed. So
those are the profound things, aren't they? Those are the profound things, especially feedback, especially that.
Yes.
That can be really difficult because there's a vulnerability in that. And I think it's fantastic that you were able to do that. So I have a lot of conversations with people around this and around kind of managing that situation. And I loved what you said there too about the kind of the reflective writing and the journaling, because that can be such a powerful practice, as you say, for life, not just for in the PhD process, but for life. And I really would recommend people exploring that if they haven't already.
Yeah.
Were there any texts that kind of help you into that, or you just intuitively found your way into that?
There were different things that I kind of became obsessive about looking after myself during my PhD. So I read a lot and I watched a lot. And I'm not going to lie, it definitely was, as I mentioned earlier, a space of procrastination for me. But there was some different, I remember at the time when I started my PhD, the only reason I started a writing practice because it was when, do you remember when wellness was like super exciting and everybody was talking about writing your gratitude lists? Do you remember that?
Love it.
Yeah.
I still do. I'm still there.
Yeah.
I'm still.
Yeah. And people think it's a bit naff, but actually there were some days I would sit down at my computer and I would just not be motivated, or I would just be in a kind of negative Nancy mood, and I would sit and write down what I was grateful for and why. I am grateful for X because of this. And I always felt better when I did it. It helped me move into a different headspace. So I did that quite regularly. So I kind of started with that, and then I read a lot of hippy dippy stuff. So I don't know if other people want to hear this, but at this time I got exposed to this woman called Gabby Bernstein, who's like a lot of academics are like, oh God, some new.
No, I love her. You are me. Yeah. You're my lost twin. I'm now convinced of this. Gabby Bernstein, love her. Yes.
Yeah, loved her
because she's brilliant.
Yeah, I loved her because she had very clear like action plans, step 1, step 2, step 3 for moving through things.
Yes,
and a large part of her work is actually having a writing practice. So I did that, and to be honest, it really did keep me sane. So I did things like I would write down what I was grateful for, but then it kind of really developed from there. And funny, when I was preparing for this podcast, I started to look back on some of the things that I'd done, and I'd actually forgotten about some of the things that I'd done. But some of it was when I was having a day where I clearly was feeling like a failure, or I couldn't do something, because that was something that came up a lot for me. I can't do this. I'm not capable. Was I would sit and write out what I was scared of. Like, because often I remember reading this really good book at some point in my PhD. It was a book called Emotional Agility by this woman called Susan David. And she was like a Harvard psychologist, I want to say. And she talked about emotions. And she said, emotions are just beacons. They're signs of something that's going on underneath. They're the visible sign, but there's something else going on. And for me, when I was feeling, I came out of, say, a supervisory meeting where maybe I didn't get a lot of positive feedback. I would feel like I can't do this. I'm no good. There was a lot going on underneath there. Yes. That was a bit more than anger, frustration, and worry. So I had to kind of dig deep in, and I used that writing practice as a way to do that, to go, well, what's my fear here? And then I would write it down on paper and read it out loud to myself and go, that's nuts.
Right.
That's nuts.
Right.
But I wouldn't have recognized that until I put it down on a piece of paper.
Exactly. And it's kind of the thing, isn't it? We're the only ones who are really entitled to say that to ourselves, because if you said it to somebody else and they said that's nuts, you'd be like, well, actually, do you know what? Whereas if you say it to yourself, you can kind of really commune with yourself in that way. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I also, I remember I looked back at that stuff the other day, and I did things like when I wasn't feeling great, I wrote down, why am I proud of myself? What have I done to be proud of myself so far? Yeah. And then you put it down on paper and you go, holy crap, I've done a lot by 25.
Yeah.
Let it, stop beating yourself up so much. So that, was definitely an important part of me sort of maintaining my sanity. And a lot of the time it was very basic things. I don't think I can fix this section of my PhD. Okay, well, what can we do? How can we tackle this? And writing it down in steps for how I was going to approach it. And the reality is that what you're going to do is you're going to read your comments, you're going to walk away for a couple of days, you're going to come back and approach it with a creative attitude, try and find the solution, send it for more feedback, and repeat.
Yes.
But sometimes that feels impossible.
Yeah. I've just written down this quote: "Stop beating yourself up so much." That is the quote. That's it. Yeah, and I think because it can feel so tough, and we make it harder for ourselves sometimes. And I do mean I make it harder for myself sometimes. I do mean,
and it feels very personal. And I think sometimes what is hard about the PhD is you sit down and you face yourself every day in a way that you don't in other jobs.
Absolutely. You are right face to face with yourself. Yeah. And that's not always easy.
No, it's not. But sometimes you have to remind yourself of, I'm not as bad as what the voice maybe in my head tells me sometimes. And also it is about, you know, what are the great things, what are the things that are thriving in my life, rather than what are the things that, you know, I'm amplifying that I'm maybe not doing so well. And I think sometimes you have to put that down on paper and read it, and then you go, do you know what, I'm not so bad.
Love it.
And it makes it much easier to move into a space of kind of peace and contentment, and that's where you do your best work. And I think that's why it's so important for you to really acknowledge what's going on in your head and what's going on with you emotionally, because when you're in a space of contentment and peace, that's when you do your best work. It's not when you're swinging from the extreme highs to the extreme lows.
No, I love that. There's so much good stuff in there. And now I'm going to ask you to give one top tip out of all of that. Or indeed, in addition to all of that. So in terms of thinking about, I loved what you talked when we were emailing backwards and forwards. You talked about making balance the goal. And so we've got that in here. We've got this sense of how to deal with loss, how to stop beating yourself up, how to make balance the goal. What would be your top tip or top tips to take away?
Well, one of the things I think with kind of the idea of maintaining balance is I think we're often really geared towards achievement. And, you know, how many conferences can we get to? How many papers can we get out? How much practice can we do on top of the regular work of the PhD? Because I need to come out of this as kind of a competitive researcher in an ever shrinking market, right? So you get kind of stuck on that hamster wheel, and you can, if you think of yourself as being like a pendulum, you kind of swing really far to the left and really far to the right between these extreme highs and the extreme lows. And you also can set yourself up for this idea that that when I get to X, I'll be happy, and that's very dangerous. You know, we call it I think they call it in psychology like the arrival fallacy, that when I get to X, I'll feel. And actually, I think there's a lot to be said for trying to be in this space where the pendulum's kind of in the middle and you're in a space of contentment rather than these extreme highs and extreme lows. And I think one thing people should always do is just really take the moments to appreciate those moments where you have pockets of contentment. So for me, I remember being in my second year, and I was at that point where first year I kind of didn't really know what I was supposed to do every day. Second year, I knew what I was supposed to be doing every day, and I was reading and I was getting into the really good stuff and I was really enjoying it. And I had a funded PhD, and I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. I'm getting paid to think big thoughts and think about this thing that I love. So one of my top tips is really just, instead of thinking about the big goals, I think this idea of productivity and goal, you know, setting goals is important in the world that we live in. But I also think, you know, don't think that the best day is going to be when you hand in your thesis. It'll be a massive anticlimax. Instead, kind of take moments in your day to appreciate the kind of the lovely parts of the PhD process where you're just really content, you're just really enjoying yourself, and where you've had the space and time to think about stuff that you love and enjoy. I think that's one of the best things you can do. That's
so gorgeous and so achievable for everyone to just have that moment. Thank you for that. And thank you for all of it. For being here, for sharing your story, for sharing all those strategies, for being my twin, mostly. Thank you so much, Lauren. And we will, in the show notes, we'll have the references and things and more information. But for now, thank you so much, Lauren, for being here. And thank you for listening.
Happy to be here.